we'll keep updating you of the programme and how you can get involved. There'll be competitions as well. We're getting very slick, aren't we? Anyway, let's start this webinar that you're all here for. So we've got Patrick McGuigan, who you all know about now. He's food cheese journalist, writes the library of cheeses, training partner for the Academy, has written a lovely little book, she says, The Philosophy of Cheese. I've usually got one somewhere to hand.
Available in all good bookstores. Buy it from an independent. That's my advice. Don't get it from Amazon, although it is available.
All the British Cheese Library sell it as well, don't they?
The British Library does, yeah.
And then on accompanying Patrick with whiskey expertise, we have the lovely Becky, and she's going to tell you all about herself. I'm going to drop out now, guys. Over to you, and have a lovely evening. I'll be back with questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tracy.
So much, Tracy.
Becky, do you want to chat? And I'm going to try and work out how to share my screen and get some slides up, I think.
Okay, you do that. You figure out how to use Zoom, like you've not had a whole year to do that.
I've only been doing it for a year. I'm still not very good at it.
Tracy, thanks so much. The British Cheese Weekender sounds incredible. I want a piece of that action. That sounds awesome. As Tracy mentioned, and as Pat said, my name's Becky. I'm Becky Paskin. I'm a whiskey journalist, presenter. I've been writing about whiskey for about 13 years now. I was previously editor of a publication called The Spirits Business, and also a website called scotchwhisky.com, and I've been freelance for the last year. I do a lot of whiskey consultancy and masterclasses. I do a lot of whiskey tastings, and I also co-founded, there we are. I also co-founded a platform called Our Whisky, which is it's all about championing diversity in the whiskey industry. I think a lot of people have in the back of their mind this idea that whiskey is a very masculine style of drink, but the reality is obviously anybody can enjoy it, anyone can drink it, and hopefully we'll be finding out a little bit today about how you can enjoy it alongside some yummy cheese as well, which Pat has so kindly managed to source for us. And right now I'm just smelling this incredible cheese that's right in front of us.
There's quite an aroma in the room at the moment, I have to say.
Yes. And we've got 3 really amazing whiskies lined up as well. So I think obviously we published on the Academy of Cheese website what whiskies and what cheeses we're going to be tasting today. So if you have had a chance to get hold of those, that's brilliant. But if you haven't, then what I'd recommend is, if you do have any cheese in the house, go and grab a bit. If you've got any whiskey in the house, go and grab some of that as well, and just join us with a dram and some cheese, and just get involved really. And if you have any questions as we're going through, I'll be happy to answer. I can't see the chat anymore, it's disappeared. Oh no, here we go. If anybody has any particular questions about whiskey, everybody watching, are we familiar with whiskey? Are we all whiskey drinkers here, or are we wanting to find out a little bit more about it? So if you have any particular questions, then please do ask away.
I think, Becky, we've got quite a mixed audience actually. I think there's a lot of whiskey people that you've brought with you who might not be so familiar with cheese, or they might be. And vice versa. So I mean, I'm going to put my hands up straight away and say I'm not a whiskey drinker, and I've struggled with whiskey over the years. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to do, this talk came out of a Twitter conversation, I think, didn't it?
Yes.
And I feel like I'm missing out with whiskey. I love all alcohol, and I'm really into flavour and complexity and amazing, craft products, food and drink. And whiskey I struggle with, and I thought, well, maybe this is the way. What I need is you to kind of help me to understand whiskey, and I thought maybe matching it with cheese actually might help me as well, because obviously I love cheese. Yes.
Well, I hope to. Pat, I forgot to actually mention at the start, do you have any water with you?
I do, yes, I have water. Now I've got a question first up. I don't know if anyone else is going to ask questions. I'm going to ask you lots of questions. I've got a question about glassware before we even get started. So I do have a little whiskey glass, that I got sent once. I don't know if that's an appropriate.
Okay, excellent. So that glass is called a Glencairn. So that's a specific type of glass. That's also what I have.
Excellent. Okay, so that's good. Is it?
Yeah.
Is that I should be using? Because the other things I've got is I've got a sort of flat bottom tumbler.
Yes, and that's fine.
Okay.
So the difference between these glasses, so a lot of people working in the whiskey industry will drink whiskey out of a glass like this, because that bulb at the bottom allows the aromas to come up through into this tapered neck at the top here. So that kind of directs the aromas towards your nose. So the tumbler that you have, which is more straight lined, it's almost the equivalent of drinking a really sophisticated wine out of a pint glass. So a wine glass or a champagne flute is designed to allow the aromas to come up through the neck of the glass and directed through into your nose. Sorry, here's the glass for anybody who's asking. There we are. So that lovely bulb shape at the bottom, and then it comes up here. If you don't have one of these, that is fine. If you have a tumbler, I actually prefer to drink my whiskey out of a tumbler when I'm just sitting back on the couch, rewatching Friends for the millionth time, just kicking back and enjoying myself, because I just like the feel of it in my hand. This is a work glass. This is how I get to understand.
What about the other one I brought was like just a goblet, a wine goblet. Or I was actually looking at a wine glass and thinking, well, it would have the same thing of channeling the
So
aromas.
if you have out of those glasses that you've got there, Pat, if you want to assess the aroma and flavour of a whiskey, really understand it, a Glencairn is best. Then I would go for a wine glass, not necessarily that goblet, because that's quite open. The shape of it is quite open. So you want a wine glass that's kind of tapered in slightly. So maybe a white wine glass.
White wine glass. Okay, brilliant. Well, I'm going to stick with what's it called again? A
Glencairn.
Glencairn glass. Okay, I'm going to go with that.
Glencairn.
I love this. I am a complete whiskey virgin, basically, and you're guiding me in the absolute basics. I love it.
Well, what we'll do, Pat, is when we come to like nosing and tasting the whiskey, I'll run you through how to assess each one in the glass. The first one we're starting with is a relatively light and easy one. So
is that the which one are we starting with?
So we're going to start with the Clonakilty.
Okay, which is
this.
So I had another question. See, I'm going to ask you loads of questions. So looking at the whiskies that you've very kindly sent.
I couldn't give you the whole bottle.
No, that's fine. The colour, the range in colours is amazing for me. I wasn't expecting. I mean, the Clonakilty is really light, isn't it? I mean, it almost looks. Yeah, I mean, it could be white wine. It's not what I would think for a whiskey colour.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about whiskey is when it comes off of the still, it's clear like water. So you can't see any colour in it. So no matter what colour the beer is, because whiskey is essentially distilled beer. So it's fermented grains that you create an alcohol base of like about 8% ABV, and then that's distilled. So you're separating the alcohol from the water, and you're creating a spirit which is around about 70% ABV. When it comes off of the still, it's clear like water, and then that's put into a cask, and by law whiskey has to be matured for 3 years in a wooden cask. In Scotland it has to be oak. That's not necessarily the case everywhere. In America, for bourbon, it has to be new American oak specifically. So it changes depending on where the whiskey is from, but once it comes out of the cask, it takes all of that lovely colour with it. So all of the oakiness comes with it. So a light looking whiskey, and you can tell the difference, a light style of whiskey will have not had very much impact from the cask. Whereas something which is, we'll see the difference in colour there, something which is a little bit more coloured tends to suggest it's either been in cask for a long period of time, or it's been in a larger cask, or a sherry butt, because a cask that's been used previously before, maybe to mature bourbon or wine, red wine or sherry, will have some of that liquid will have leached into the wood itself. So when it's maturing, some of that wine and sherry does come out into the liquid and does colour it. So that's kind of a background of where it kind of comes from.
So the Clonakilty, how long's the Clonakilty been in the barrel for then?
So Clonakilty is a no age statement. Shall we start running through some of the slides, and do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll call them up again. Sorry, yeah. Let me. I think very rudely, because I think cheese is the most important thing in the world, I've gone cheese first, you see. It goes cheese whiskey, I think. Hold on a sec. But that's fine. I can skip through to the whiskey section, and we can go back to cheese. Okay.
Beauty Morton, thank you so much. That's very kind of you. I saw there was a comment earlier, I can't scroll back up now, where somebody said they've got the cheese, but they could only find some other whiskies, one of which was a Lagavulin. I think that's a great choice, actually. There's one of the cheeses we're having would go great with a Lagavulin. I'm not sure which one you have, probably the 16, but let's carry on.
Here we go. So here we go. Here's the whiskey.
Right.
Do you want to give a bit of chat about it? And I'm just going to sniff it and taste it. I mean, I'm used to drinking wine. Is it a similar process?
Okay, so what I would suggest is when you're coming to whiskey for the first time, and for those of you who are new to whiskey or maybe are just not that sure about it yet, I'm just going to give a very quick run through about how to nose and taste whiskey so you get the most out of it. It's very obviously different to wine and beer and other kinds of alcoholic drinks because it is a spirit and it's very high in alcohol. So minimum is 40% ABV. So it can be quite confronting to you if you're not used to it. So baby steps, take your time with it. What I like to do first is bring it up to my nose and take a smell. Don't put your nose all the way in the glass, just sort of hover outside and gently just try and pick up what aromas might be coming out of there. The funny answer, Pat, which the smart ass answer is, oh, I just smell whiskey.
I wasn't going to say that.
But this one's Clonakilty. I'll dive into everything that I'm picking up in this in a minute. But once you're nosing, you'll get an idea of the different aromas that are present in there. And whiskey comes in all shapes and sizes. So there are broadly 4 main flavour camps. They're smoky, fruity, malty and floral, and there's some crossover in between there. So generally a lot of whiskey, because it's matured in an oak cask, you'll probably smell some vanilla, which is from the vanillin that resides within oak, and there'll be maybe some fruitiness coming through, which tends to come from the new make spirit, and there may be other elements too, maybe chocolate, maybe dried fruit. Maybe then you can dig down into exactly what type of dried fruit. Is it dried orange peel? Is it raisins or sultanas? Is there any spice in there? Is there, what kind of spice? Cinnamon, nuts, that kind of thing. So take a little nose, and then when you're ready, take a little sip, just a small sip, coat your mouth, and then let it drop down the back of your throat. I always find the first sip to be a really interesting one for a lot of people because your palate's not used to it. Your palate's not used to it yet. So just sort of let it sit on your palate, because there'll be alcohol, potentially alcohol burn if you're not used to it.
Yeah, that's the thing that I struggle with all spirits. Really, is the alcohol. You know, just that hit of alcohol. But actually, that's a bit more. Yeah, so that's actually a lot sort of. It's got a nice fruity quality to it. Am I right in saying that?
And if you need to add water, if it's too hot, so you get that alcohol spice. If it's like, oh my god, that's too much, I can't eat, it's giving you the heartburn, add some water. I always say taste it first and then add water afterwards, because you can't take the water out. But add water just a couple of drops at a time. If you have a little squeezy dropper, brilliant, but obviously not everyone has that. Maybe just use the teaspoon to just add a few drops at a time. You don't need much in a glass like that. You don't need a lot of water, just to temper some of that alcohol heat down. And what that will also do is open up all of the aromas and flavors in the glass as well. And in fact, actually, whiskey blenders, they nose and taste whiskey at 20% ABV. This one's 43.6. So can you imagine a blender going through hundreds of samples a day, having to taste cask strength whiskey? They have to take it all down to about 20% to be able to get through them all.
Do they spit though, or do you have to swallow with whiskey, or what's the?
So if you're making whiskey, it's probably a good idea to not drink all of it, because I think that was the problem. Certainly when I do a lot of whiskey reviews, and when I'm nosing and tasting whiskey, I do spit mine out. I have a special mug that I use. It's my spit mug that I use. It's so glamorous.
Well, interestingly, when you do the World Cheese Awards and you have to taste your way through like 90 cheeses in a day, There are some judges who spit their cheese, which is one of the most disgusting things you've ever seen. I'm not one of them. I personally, I just, small amounts I can just about manage, but it does, you know, you do start to get sort of taste fatigue. I'd imagine, I mean, that's true of wine or whiskey or cheese or anything, is that, you know, if you're having to taste 20, 30, 40, you start to lose your sense of what's going on, don't you? So,
you do. That's interesting. Do you get that with cheese then? Because when I'm doing whiskey, I try to keep like how many samples I'm nosing or tasting in a day to about 20 tops. I wouldn't go above that. How many do you think you could do?
Well, at the World Cheese Awards, in the morning session, you have a table with 50 cheeses on, more or less, and there's 3 of you on a judging team, and you'll work your way through them in about 3 hours. And the trick is very small pieces, you know, really, and I'm actually using your nose as much as you're using your mouth, you know, so you can really tell a lot from cheese by feeling it, like because texture is such an important part of cheese, which it is in drinks as well. You know, wine, the texture of wine is, you know, the mouth feel of it and the body and all that sort of stuff. But with cheese particularly, you can tell quite a lot just by sort of squeezing it and sort of pulling it and smelling it and then tasting. And then we use things like, we have apples and crackers and just some things to sort of reboot the palate as you go along. Some judges actually will have a glass of wine as they go along, like a white wine, because of that acidity. I mean, it'll be like 1 glass across the whole morning just to kind of refresh. It's the French judges that often do that, which I always think is quite funny.
Oh, interesting.
Anything like that to sort of reboot the palate is
yeah, we tend to have Carr's water biscuits. They're like, for me, like the best palate cleanser, but they do leave your mouth really dry, and particularly after so much alcohol, I find that kind of it becomes quite difficult to keep going, and you have to have a break in between. It's otherwise it's too much, it's overpowering. Anyway, so just coming back to the whiskey to run through this one. So Clonakilty, you'll see on the map there, it's down on the southern coast of Ireland, and that's in County Cork. Clonakilty, this particular one that I've chosen, so Clonakilty is a relatively new distillery, so it only started making spirit in March 2019. It's a family-owned distillery. It's founded by Michael and Helen Scully, and it's you'll see just in this picture that Pat's brought up on the bottom there, there's the lighthouse down on the end. All of the surrounding fields, they're growing barley there to produce their signature Irish single pot still whiskey, which is a particular type of whiskey style that's inherent to Ireland, so it can only be made in Ireland. The one that we've got in our hands, though, because whiskey has to be matured for at least 3 years, and this distillery only opened in 2019, this whiskey has been produced at other distilleries, but it's been matured and finished at Clonakilty itself. So this is a blended whiskey. It's a blend of triple distilled malt and grain whiskey, and that, Pat, is why you find it quite light and easygoing, because grain whiskey tends to be quite light in style. It can be, because it picks up a lot of the cask character, it tends to be quite sweeter, so it won't be as overpowering. So if you're new to whiskey, my recommendation is maybe start off with some blends, because or grain whiskey, because they can be quite easier to get into. This one is it's bottled at 43.6% ABV, which is still pretty low, so it shouldn't be too hot on your palate. It's matured in ex-bourbon casks, finished in American oak, and shaved, toasted, and recharred ex-red wine European oak casks, which is a bit of a mouthful, but basically what that means is red wine casks from Europe, which have been rejuvenated to allow some of the oak to come back to life after so long, maybe maturing red wine. Pat, I don't know what I'm intrigued. What aromas are you getting from this, and what flavors?
I definitely was picking up like orangey notes. Is that fair to say? I was getting, because then you were saying, is it dried orange or fresh orange? You know, I think orange. There's clementines, tangerines. I don't know. My knowledge of orange differentials is not that good, but
no, I think you're right, and I think the important thing to remember is that taste is subjective. So if you're tasting clementines, for me it might be something else, and you can only really pick up on something, a tasting note that you're familiar with. Because if you haven't tasted some rare tea that's growing in the foothills of the Himalayan jungle somewhere, then you're never going to pick that up in a whiskey. So it's all subjective. So it's completely up to you.
I definitely, because you were saying there's 4 categories, so but I'm definitely more, is it fruity and floral, 2 of those categories, did you say? The sort of 4 main families of whiskey flavors, because I'm definitely more on that side than the smoky, you know.
It's certainly not smoky. There's no smoke in this. We do have 2 smoky whiskies, which we'll come to in a minute, but this one is, for me, there's a lot of vanilla, kind of vanilla cream, buttery vanilla coming through. There's a tiny soft spiciness, a kind of like baking spice thing going on, a bit like a birthday cake kind of thing happening. There's some milk chocolate, and
I was gonna say, do you know, I was gonna say, and I didn't want to sound like a bit of a Luddite, but I was thinking Terry's chocolate orange it came into my head. I mean, obviously not as sort of intense as that, you know, because the orange flavor it's such a fake orange flavor you get in those Terry's chocolate oranges, but definitely like a little bit like milk chocolate. I'd agree with you on milk chocolate. That it's not bitter, dark, intense. It's more sort of sweet and approachable.
Yeah, absolutely. And that floral note that you were picking up, you said it's fruity floral. I get a bit of cut grass, a kind of like almost slightly dried grass, hay kind of thing, a little bit honeyed. So the reason I picked this whiskey to go with, which is the cheese? Is it the Durham?
So I'm going to try and go backwards on my slides. Here we go. I mean, this is nice. So I think actually we switched them around at the last minute, didn't we? Is that right?
No, this one was always paired with
this. Was always paired. Okay, great. So the cheese we have is Durham from County Cork, and it's a washed rind cheese. Are you still there, Becky?
I'm here.
This bit. So this is what's making your front room smell so pungent and aromatic, and it's the rind on this cheese. So I don't know if people, what I might do is afterwards, after I come off, I'll sort of show my cheese.
How have you cut that? Because the way you've cut your cheese is different to mine.
Well, no, I just cut a slice. That's that's what I'm eating at the moment. Just cut a slice.
I see. Okay, all right.
So it's a cow's milk cheese. It's a really old cheese, actually. They've been making it since 1979. So Jeffa Gill, who you can see in the bottom middle picture, is the lady with the glasses, and that's her daughter, who now works with her and runs the business with her today. So Jeffa set the business up in 1979 on a small holding in Cork, and made a cow's milk cheese. She had her own cows, like she had a couple of cows basically, and would just make cheese to feed her family. I mean, she's a very interesting woman. She's got a background in sort of fashion design, and sort of went to, ended up in Ireland to sort of live the good life, if you like. There's quite a lot of people who that kind of going to in Wales as well. You find a lot of these cheesemakers who in the 70s and 80s sort of decided to sort of go off grid almost and live the good life and become self-sufficient. So she was part of that movement. So she's one of the pioneers of farmhouse cheesemaking in Ireland. And what's really interesting about, we can talk about this in a minute maybe, is this idea of terroir. So I've done quite a lot with, terroir is a term that's used with wine and is sort of quite linked to really the soil. But with cheese, I would sort of broaden that idea out. There's other things in the way a cheese is made, where it's made, the climate, the geography that really influences how a cheese develops. And Durham is one of them, in that this part of Cork, actually where Clonakilty is based, you've got the Atlantic basically, and it's very briny. There's quite salty air because it's so coastal. And so when you make cheese there, the sort of smelly, pungent bacteria that grows on these cheeses, these washed rind cheeses, just kind of naturally forms because you have that salty air. So Cork is a hotbed of washed rind cheese making, and I'll explain what washed rind is in a minute, but there were four really world-class washed rind cheeses made there. So there's another one called Gabine, there's one called Ardrahan, which I think is now out of production, and Malines as well, and Durrus is part of that family. So it's really weird. This little corner of Southwest Ireland has just naturally, these cheeses are happy in that area. They kind of naturally, you get this sort of smelly rind growing on it. I'm going to come off the slide just to show you what I mean. So with a washed rind cheese, you get this kind of pinky orangey rind growing, and it's quite tacky. And when you smell it, Becky, it's pretty full on. It's quite, what do you get on the rind there?
Well, it's really hard to pinpoint what that is. It's bacteria.
It's a bit sort of funky, isn't it?
Well, what's interesting is in whiskey and wine, there's a character we call it butyric acid.
Yeah, you get that in cheese as well.
Exactly. And in whiskey, I'm actually, so I used to make cheese. This is how Pat and I know each other, because we're both cheese geeks. But I used to make cheese. I went to the School of Artisan Food to make cheese, and I learned, I can't remember her name. You'll be able to tell me, the woman who invented Tunworth, who creates Tunworth.
Stacey Hedges, was it?
Don't remember, but
Julie Cheney. Was it Julie Cheney?
Cheney, yes. So she taught me how to make cheese. So I was making cheese at home for a while. So for me, whenever I smell a whiskey and I taste the whiskey, I'm very susceptible to butyric acid character, which comes across. It presents as baby sick or cheese, and it's so in a whiskey, not many people can pick it up. And I'm like, oh, I can, and it's not always the best thing to have, but sometimes it's there and it actually adds. So there's a whiskey called Clynelish, which has a bit of butyric acid character, but Clynelish is a very waxy kind of style of whiskey, which actually would pair beautifully with cheese, because those two, the textures would really match together nicely. So smelling that, for me, it's like, oh, that's just butyric acid. It's nutty, and there's a nuttiness to it.
Well, often with these washed rind cheeses, so what I mean by washed rind is, as these cheeses are maturing, the cheese maker or the cheese maturer will sort of rub the rind of the cheese with brine, or brine with a little bit of alcohol in, so they might use Epoisse, which is a very famous washed rind cheese, has Marc de Bourgogne, a kind of grape brandy added to the wash. Stinking Bishop has pear cider added to the wash, and what it does is it encourages these sticky, pungent, quite powerful bacteria to grow. There's a particular family of bacteria called Brevibacteria, and it's actually, you find that bacteria on human skin. So often with these cheeses, you will get a sort of sweaty socks, really quite funky. Sometimes they smell a bit like rotting, dying things, and are quite. This doesn't actually. It has quite a nice sort of farmy. But it does have a bit of sort of decay about it, in a good way, like
a little bit like
go on, say
it. Hay caked in horseshit.
Yeah, brilliant. I was going to say that sort of hay, sort of warm hay, like where and manure, farmyard, a bit.
Manure is a nicer way of putting it.
Yeah, farmyardy would be a way that people would describe it. But what's interesting about these cheeses, often you smell the rind. Like if you smell a ripe Epoisse, you can think, I'm not going to put this in my mouth because it smells like death. I'm not going to eat this. But the paste inside with these style of cheeses is often quite buttery and mild, and sort of when you actually put it in your mouth and taste it, it balances it all out. So, and I think this is a really good example. It's quite pungent on the rind, but when it's got such a lovely kind of buttery paste, and you can see the rind is starting to break the cheese down, so you have this sort of softer layer underneath. So the bacteria, and there will be yeasts and molds that will grow as well, they sort of break the cheese down from the outside in, and as that happens, you get these lovely aromas being released. And I don't know about you, but there's definitely a bit of cocoa in this cheese. I don't know if you got a bit of cocoa when you eat, not on the smell, but when you eat it. I got a bit of like sweet chocolate, a little bit of chocolate at the end.
It was just this nice kind of, I think maybe because I'm picking up some nuttiness from the rind and then that creamy, buttery milkiness from the center. Those two are coming together to make me think of like hazelnut chocolate Ferrero Rocher kind of style.
Yeah.
So when
Ciao, I like that.
well, we got the tasting notes through from IWSC, which is who we sourced the cheeses through, and I immediately thought, oh, I've got a great whiskey that will go with that, because I pick up so much milk chocolate and creaminess from the Clonakilty. I didn't even think, only occurred to me afterwards, like, oh yeah, they're from the same county and island, so that makes sense. Although remember that this particular Irish whiskey is sourced, so it's not actually made at the distillery, it's matured there. But I feel like when we talk about terroir, and it's interesting that you know, the makers of Duras are a mother and daughter team, because I believe in the concept of social terroir. So the idea that our experiences are portrayed through the product of whatever it is we're making. So whether that's making cheese or whiskey or writing about it or talking about it, we pick up on certain elements and we express ourselves through our craft. And it's so in a way, like the background of the family behind Clonakilty and Duras as well, this County Cork heritage, I suppose, just comes through in both of these products. So I think it's, I don't know about you, Pat, is this a successful match? Are you happy with this?
Well, do you know what? That whiskey was really good. That was a really nice whiskey for me. You know, you didn't go in with a big peated, you know, malt whiskey. But I like that. It was light and floral and fruity and much more my cup of tea. And actually, I thought that was nice. I mean, it's a bit of an. I hate these tastings where people are sort of. This is how we've chosen this, and this is how it should be. You know, I quite like a bit of, well, let's see. That doesn't work very well. I really like that. I think that is a genuinely quite a nice match. Yeah. I think what's interesting, we've picked cheeses that are quite strong flavored. You know, these are all quite powerful cheeses. So we've got a washed rind, a smoked cheese that we'll come on to in a minute, and a blue. And I do feel, because of that extra alcohol in the whiskey, you do need cheese with a bit of oomph, which is a technical term. But I don't know. I mean, have you ever matched whiskey with something really light, like a sort of young goat's cheese, or would that work, or would the whiskey overpower the cheese, do you think?
Well, I think the secret to matching food and drink is to match power with flavor, with texture. So think about, let's take whiskey for instance. So say you're like Patrick and you're like, do you know what? I can only really handle the light stuff. I can only do a really light whiskey. What cheese should I pair with this, or what food should I pair with it? Well, what you don't want is for your food to overpower the whiskey, and you don't want your whiskey to overpower the food. So make sure you pick like for like in terms of power, so in terms of strength. So make sure that there's balance between those two. And then think about the flavors. So I believe in either complementing or contrasting when it comes to pairing. So either you compare like for like. So in the Duras, there's creaminess, milkiness, and milk chocolate, and the same in the whiskey as well. So those two flavors sort of pair together. In the next couple of cheeses we come along to, there's a bit of contrasting. And actually what Pat said, we didn't want to be prescriptive with this and say, well, you have to match this with this. Actually, we matched them, not having tasted the cheese and the whiskey side by side. And this morning I, for breakfast, because that's like a bit of a job, managed to get hold of the cheese. And I did a bit of sampling side by side, and I actually switched them around because I actually thought the next cheese, the smoked cheese, which we're going to come on to, actually paired better with a different whiskey.
Well, let's move on. I mean, there's some nice comments coming through about someone said whiskey with goat's cheese and honey, which is quite a nice. I like that idea.
A nice honeyed whiskey as well. Actually, somebody was saying Singleton, that'd be a great whiskey. There's a lot of honey is a characteristic in a lot of whiskey, so definitely go in for it.
It's still breakfast here in the US, someone's saying. So yeah, breakfast whiskey is that's allowed, isn't it? Right, let's move on. So we've done the Clonakilty. What are we moving on to next? So we've got a smoked sheep's milk cheese from Spain. Yes. What are we drinking with this, Becky?
Okay, so we're going to move on to. Do you want to put up the slides?
Yeah. You talk. I'll
talk. So the next whiskey we're going to move on to is Benromach, and this is a Speyside single malt. So this is a Scotch whiskey. So we've gone from Ireland to Scotland. So Benromach 15-year-old is the one that we're going to be tasting today. If we can find it.
Yeah, there it is. Benromach. Okay, so this is quite dark, isn't it? This is the darker one.
This is so this is the darkest one. And do you remember where I said a lot of colour comes from is the cask?
So this is 15 years, so it's had a long time in the cask, is it?
Yeah, well, it's had a long time resting in cask, but a big proportion of the cask, the cask's makeup. So it's been matured in ex-bourbon, which is the same as Clonakilty, but it's also been matured in ex-sherry casks. So it's picked up a lot of that lovely rich dark flavour from the sherry casks. And this is actually a sweeter style of whiskey, more dried fruit than you would have found in the Clonakilty.
Yeah, so I was just thinking fruit cake there.
Yeah, and that is a classic tasting note of sherry matured whiskies, Christmas cake, which confuses people when you talk to anybody outside of the UK about Christmas cake. They're like, what's that? We forget that it's a British thing. No one else really knows it. So Benromach is a distillery. It's in Speyside. It's just close to the coast there. It's in the town called Forres, which is a lovely little town. It was built in 1898, so it's over 123 years old. 123 years old. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. It was built then. It was making whiskey all the way through. It closed briefly in 1983. There was a surplus of whiskey in Scotland in 1983. A whole ton of whiskey distilleries closed, and Benromach was one of them. But it was reopened 10 years later by Gordon and MacPhail. They're a very old, well-established Scotch whisky independent bottler, and they've been making whisky there ever since. So Benromach 15-year-old is actually, it was named the Whisky Exchange's Whisky of the Year. So the Whisky Exchange is a very popular online whisky retailer. So all of the whiskies that we've got today can be bought from them. This has been matured in ex-sherry casks. It's got a high emphasis on sherry. And what's interesting about Benromach is a lot of people think that peated whiskey comes from Islay, which is in the very bottom left-hand corner of the screen. There's an island. That's Ireland, and the next whiskey is from Islay. But so Benromach is actually peated. So there'll be some smoke coming through on this one.
Yeah, I'm getting a bit of like almost like a dried leather, like leathery, or in a nice, that makes it sound not very nice, but in a really like right at the finish, you got that sort of leathery, smoky thing going on, which was lovely. I wasn't expecting that, and it wasn't overpowering, but it was it just came in at the end and just sort of gave you a nice finish to the whiskey. So it was all fruitcake, and I got orange again. I don't know whether that's because I'm looking at a bottle of orange coloured whiskey, and I'm just thinking the power of suggestion, and because of the last one. But I was getting that sort of fruitcake, orangey fruitcake, and then leather and smoke at the end, but not in a big way. It's not a big smoky hit, is it?
It's a very subtle smoke. It's more, and there are different types of smoke. There's all the way from, a kind of what I like to term sort of meaty smoked bacon, kind of a bonfire or a barbecue style of smoke, all the way through to a more like ashiness, like coal, or even medicinal kind of TCP style of smoke. There's a whole spectrum of smoke. So if you taste a smoky whiskey, you think, I don't like that, I don't like smoke, try a different smoky whiskey, because there's different types. I'll talk more about peat, which is where a lot of smoke character comes from with the next whiskey. But this one, I thought, I originally had paired with the blue that we've got coming up next, but actually on tasting it, I felt this went really well with the Spanish.
Gorgeous, it's gorgeous. Because what's really good about it, because so smoked cheese has a bit of a bad reputation, really, and for a long time I thought smoked cheese was rubbish. But like anything, once you get into you get deeper into a subject, there's a lot of terrible smoked cheese, but there are some really good examples. And actually on the Academy of Cheese course, what we do a smoked cheddar as one of the 25 cheeses that you study. And there's some terrible smoked cheddars, but some really good ones from sort of small producers who, so with cheddar, what you would typically do is make your cheddar, age it for a year, cut it into wedges, and then they would cold smoke it over oak for say 12 to 24 hours, a bit like you would with smoked salmon. And so it does give quite a strong smoky flavour to those smoked cheddars. But the best ones, you can taste the cheese and the smoke, so you have a sort of a balance. It's not just all smoke. This cheese is unusual. All the cheeses that we're tasting, Becky, are from a brilliant cheesemonger called I.J. Mellis, who have been selling cheese in Edinburgh, and they've got a shop in Glasgow and I think St Andrews as well, for 25 years. And Rory, who's the son, Rory Mellis, who's sort of coming into the business, has a great affinity with Spain. He speaks Spanish. He lived there for a while. And so he's got all these great kind of weird Spanish cheeses that you don't normally see in the UK. And this is one of them. It's called humo, which is basically Spanish for smoke. And it's a sheep's milk cheese. It's a very unusual, I mean, I haven't seen this cheese anywhere else. I think they work with a very good cheesemonger in Madrid called Cultivo, who have got that picture there. And so sheep's milk cheese, made a bit like a manchego, I suppose. So it's quite hard, aged for sort of somewhere between 6 and 9 months. And that sort of burnt out room that you're looking at on the left is where they smoke the cheeses. But instead of smoking it in one big go, you know, like you would with cheddar, that they put the cheeses in the room for sort of 2 or 3 hours. They light beechwood in that dustbin, basically. So they fill the entire room with smoke from beechwood, but just for a few hours, and then they take the cheeses out again, and they'll do that for about a week. So what it means is you get a lovely, delicate, sort of sweet smoke to this cheese. There is smoke there, but it's not overpowering like some cheddar, smoked cheddars can be really smoky, especially with oak. There's something about the beech which is quite sweet and gentle and delicate, and you can really taste the sheep's milk cheese underneath, which is quite sweet and a bit I don't know if you were getting a bit of the sheepy notes, you know, almost a bit lanolin-y. You know, there is that sort of slightly animal flavor to it, but sheep's milk cheese generally tend to have a sweetness about them, a kind of inherent sweetness which make them, they're some of my favorite cheeses actually, sheep's milk. I think that's really works quite well, because they're not, neither the whiskey or the cheese are massively smoky, but just they have a kind of fragrant aromatic quality to them.
So I think what really works well here is I'm really enjoying this humo, by the way. It's so right, good, just like stuffing it in. I think what really works well here is there are 2 boxes being ticked when it comes, you know, the food and drink pairing boxes. There is the power. They're both, I think, on 3 boxes. They're on equal playing fields when it comes to the intensity of flavour that's coming through. I also feel like there is the smoke complements each other, because the Benromach is so subtly smoky and the humo is subtly smoky too. But then they contrast. So I'm getting quite a bit of acidity from the cheese, but then a lot of fruitiness from the whiskey. So those 2 are like against each other. So you've got everything lining up in this combo, which is a nice.
Do you know what? It makes the cheese taste better, and I think the cheese makes the whiskey taste. But like, I'm actually discovering things in the whiskey that I hadn't spotted before, because the cheese is. I think you're right on that fruity. It's bringing out the fruitiness of the whiskey, the acidity, the kind of the sharpness of the cheese.
Yeah, I think the cheese is heightening some of the smoke in the whiskey, and then when you come back to the cheese, it's cutting through that fruitiness, and like you get a little. My mouth is watering.
That's really good, isn't it? I mean, you can see if you look at I'll come off the screen. If you look at, you can see on the rind of this, you can see where when cheeses have been properly smoked, and by that I mean a lot of smoked cheeses, a liquid flavoring is added to the curd, and you can sort of taste it, you know, like Applewood, which is really famous, sort of smooth. They have a slightly, and those little German cheese sausages.
Oh, I love those.
No, I love them as well, but they're kind of really, it's a bit like, I love them in the same way that I love Frankfurters. They're quite synthetic and weird, but you quite like them. But when it's smoked, when you do a traditional smoking actually over smoke, you get much more interesting smoky flavor, I think, and just a more pleasant one. But you can see, that it changes the color of the cheese. Basically, you get this sort of dark, waxy rind on the cheese, and that's just the smoke building up.
Interesting. So for those kinds of cheeses, the applewood and the smoked sausage style, they add something to that.
It's a flavoring. It's like liquid smoke flavoring. Yeah, they don't smoke the cheese as you would in a traditional way over, oak chippings or beechwood, smouldering beechwood chips or whatever.
As Lucy Morton has just said, so wrong but so good. Yeah, I agree, and I don't think it's going to put me off eating that lovely cheese.
So what's really nice is I'm really pleased that we put the list of cheeses out, and I've noticed on Twitter quite a lot of people have bought exactly the same cheeses that we're tasting. I don't know whether they've invested in 3 bottles of whiskey as well, but that's great. It's great when people. I mean, that Humo cheese is definitely it's. If you think you don't like smoked cheese, try this one, because it's a different sort of ballpark.
I think what might be useful is so I'm going to recommend other types of whiskey. If you haven't got this Benromach 15, then seek out another fruity sweet style of whiskey with a little bit of smoke to it. I think something like Ardbeg Uigeadail would be quite nice. So look for sherry cask maturation and a bit of peat, and I think that together will balance quite nicely with a smoked cheese like this.
We've got someone, Evan, has said burnt orange peel. Not quite sure what that relates to, but I think that actually now this is the power of suggestion. When people say pineapple to me, I suddenly start tasting pineapple. Actually I don't, but burnt orange peel is quite a nice. I quite like that. Maybe for the first. Well, no, actually, I was definitely getting a bit of orange with Benromach. Were you getting orange? Have I just sort of got orange in my head now from the first whiskey?
There's definitely this kind of like orange zest when you've like zested an orange over a cocktail or something, or maybe like when it was cool to burn the orange zest as it went over a cocktail, and you get like that burst of flame. I'm talking about my bartender days here. That's what we used to do over like cocktails, like an old fashioned, which you wouldn't do anymore. But there's Lucy's just sent in a question on the Q&A. Is there a maximum cheese can be smoked for?
No, I mean, well, I don't know. I mean, you could smoke a cheese as long as you want, really. But I mean, typically with a cheddar, 24 hours is max. Because I think what you want to do with if you've got a really good cheese, is you don't want to just completely obliterate it with smoke. So what I'm looking for when I'm assessing a smoked cheese is to be able to taste the cheese. Historically, if you made some bad cheese, well, we'll just smoke that one because no one will be able to taste it anyway. So it's quite a fine art to do a good smoked cheese. You've got to be gentle with it, I would say. Less is more. But I like this idea of just a couple of hours smoking each day, and then you take the cheeses out and then they have a little rest, and the next day it's almost like they have their sort of smoke treatment each day. But yes, I think I've just seen the time, Becky. Let's move on to the final pairing.
Right, final whiskey. This is the most powerful one. I guess this is the wild card for you because
I might not like this.
You were a fan of the Benromach and the Clonakilty. So this is Port Charlotte, 10-year-old. This is a heavily peated single malt whiskey from Islay. So
that's a cool bottle, isn't it?
Nice, isn't that awesome?
That is so cool. I like that. That's very funky.
You want to use this as a vase or something afterwards. It's really nice.
Can I just say something though, Becky? Yours seems to be a bit bigger than mine. What's going on there?
Well, learn about whiskey.
Okay.
I'm not wasting up a bottle on you and you're not even sure if you're going to like it.
No, fair play. Good shout.
So this is a whiskey from the island of Islay. So Port Charlotte is a style of spirit that's made at Brewing Distillery. It's a coastal distillery. It's in the middle of the island, but it's still sat on the coast. So the whiskey that's matured in its warehouses gets like quite a bit of a battering from the breeze coming off of the sea. It was built in 1881. It has changed hands quite a few times over the years, and then it closed in 1995. It wasn't long before it was brought back to life again in 2000. It's become Brewing as a distillery is a cult classic. Whiskey fans all over the world love it. Port Charlotte is one of a few styles that they make at the distillery. So Brewing as a whiskey is unpeated. There is Port Charlotte, which is a heavily peated whiskey, and then Octomore, which is like the big guns of peat. So if you love your smoke, you love your peat, Octomore is the one for you. So this one's the middle of the level. I love Port Charlotte. This is a brilliant whiskey for me. This one is peated to, so if you're not sure what peat is, so there's a picture here in the top right hand corner, which is a big pile of what looks like dirt. Essentially that's peat, it's peat brick, so it's essentially decayed plant matter which is on its way to becoming coal. It's full of energy. So when you burn that historically in Scotland, they would burn peat bricks on their fires for warmth rather than anything like coal, because Scotland is abundant in peat. So when the distilleries, especially back in 1881 when Brewing was first built, they were burning peat in their kiln to dry their barley, and that's why their whiskey was traditionally peated. So that's where the peat flavour comes from. Peat can come from all over Scotland. These guys are using Islay peat, so it has flavours of decaying plants from around the island. So it's going to have a bit more of a saltiness to it, a bit more of a maritime character. Whereas peat that's from the mainland, like the style that Benromach is using, is going to be less so, because it's going to be more shrubby, more heather, more honeyed kind of flavours coming out of that peat. So it depends on where it comes from, the different plants that are growing, and the terroir basically. So this whiskey is it's peated to 40 parts per phenol parts per million, which gives you an idea of how much peatiness in there. I think I mentioned Ardbeg Ugadal earlier. I think that's 30, so this is 10 above. It's matured for 10 years. It's matured in American oak and French wine casks, and this one's bottled at 50% ABV. So this is a jump up, Pat.
Yeah,
you stuck
it took my breath away a bit.
So
I felt slightly faint actually after taking that sip, but no, it's actually, once you got past that, I like it. It's great. I mean, with the cheese, it really, I kind of feel I really wanted something to go with it. You know, like I needed some ballast to the alcohol, and it worked quite well.
Yeah,
it's not as smoky and peaty as I sort of would expect. I don't know. I think maybe I've just been trying the wrong whiskies, and I've had aggressive. Can you get quite sort of aggressive, peaty, smoky whiskies that are a bit in your face? Because I think I've tried those and I've really found them quite hard work.
Do you remember I said there's a sliding scale?
Yeah.
Different types of smoke that you can get. Perhaps there's, there are certain distilleries like Lefroy, for instance, which is its peat character manifests as TCP, which isn't for everyone. And in fact, Lefroy is very open about the fact that not everyone likes their whiskey because it is quite divisive, that flavour. But there are other distilleries which will tend to try and have a more subtle or a barbecue-y kind of smoke, which I think works really well. What I really like about the Octomore, even though it's 10 years old, so I mean, looking at the colour again of that, which is more on a par with the Clonakilty, but the red wine character comes through really nicely, and it's got this beautiful fruitiness to it, which I think balances the acidity in the blue. But the peat and the maritime character is a little bit salty in the whiskey, I think, also works well with the saltiness in the blue. So there's, again, it's that it's comparing and contrasting those flavors, but also trying to match the intensity of the cheese. And I had the whiskeys, the Benromach matched with this one. I don't know if you wanted to try that, Pat, but when I tried it this morning, I actually wasn't happy with it, so I switched.
I'm gonna have to go back. Yeah, I've still got. Let me let me just do it in there. Yeah, I'll try that. I definitely agree with you on that salty thing going on though. They sort of dovetailed around the salt, I thought, which was nice, and it's quite a big cheese. You know, it's got a bit of power and muscle about it, that blue, which is if I can get my slides to go backwards, it's Hebridean blue, which is made on the Isle of Mull. They're best known, this cheesemaker, for making Isle of Mull cheddar, which is quite a big, bold farmhouse cheddar. And part of the reason for that, and this is going back to terroir actually, is the cows are not out at grass at pasture as long as they would be, say, in Devon or Somerset, for obvious reasons. You know, the weather in Mull is just that bit wetter and colder, so you know they have a shorter grazing season. So they're in the sheds a bit longer, and so when they do come into the sheds, they feed them hay and silage, which they've made themselves during the summer, but they also use spent whiskey grains from the Tobermory, the draff from the Tobermory distillery, and that gives their cheddar a really kind of slightly wild, fermented. I always think it's like a bracing walk along the sea, along the beach or something. Their cheddar, it's not shy. So Hebridean Blue is a sort of newer cheese for them. It's aged for about 8 weeks, so it's relatively young. It's not as big as a Stilton, you know, in terms of the wheels that they make, so they don't age it for so long. So this would have been made when the cows were in the sheds. And the cows would have, their diet is supplemented with these whiskey grains. I mean, it's not a cheese I know very well actually, and I had a good chat with Rory Mellis, because obviously, you know, he's Scottish and he's into his whiskey and he knows the Scottish cheeses really well, and he said, oh, this is a really good whiskey cheese. So this is a bit of a first. I mean, I tried it this morning obviously, but what is remarkable about it, I'll just stop sharing, is just how blue it is. I mean, the veining on that is amazing. I mean, that is some skillful cheese making, because it's quite hard to get a cheese to blue up in that way. And what it means is you get that the blue mold, which is something called Penicillin Roqueforti, gives you sort of spicy notes, and will often sort of break down the paste around it to give you to release things like ketones and alcohols and esters, which give you these kind of fruity pear drop notes and sort of alcoholic flavors actually. So I think that works really nicely with the whiskey. It's, you know, it's got a lot going on, the cheese, and I think it needs it.
I think there was somebody who was saying earlier on that they've got a Lagavulin or a Talisker. I think both of those would work really well with this one. Particularly the other option that I wanted for this cheese was the Talisker Distillers Edition. No, Lagavulin Distillers Edition, sorry, which is so big and fruity. I think it's even higher in alcohol than this one, Pat, so maybe you would have struggled, but it's a big, fruity, but smoky whiskey, so I think it would really help to balance out a lot of the big flavours coming out of this cheese. What you said about it not being aged for that long, it's still really creamy,
Yeah.
which I love. I actually think, so there's a lot of whiskey is chill filtered, which is a process of taking out a lot of like any of the molecules in the cask out of the whiskey, which might go cloudy, so you get a bit of haziness when it's sat on a shelf in a supermarket, which for a consumer doesn't look very good. There's nothing wrong with the whiskey, but a lot of whiskey is chill filtered. When you don't chill filter a whiskey, you leave in a lot of fatty molecules, which create this kind of nice oily, waxy mouthfeel. So not all whiskies do that, but if you, I think actually a waxy whiskey would have been very good with this. So maybe I can't think of what comes to the top of my mind at the moment, but a nice non-chill filtered waxy whiskey would be brilliant with this one. It's a cracking cheese.
It's really good, isn't it? I mean, it's like I say, this is the first time I've tried it. I mean, today is the first time I've tried it. Neil Mackay I think Neil Mackay is it must be a cheesemonger in his spare time, because he's written Hebridean is beautiful, slightly smoked and salty, creamy in texture and mouthfeel, lingering taste, slightly mild, creamy, smoky, spice, me fruit, back end little acid note. I think that's a beautiful description. Actually, there's a lot going on. You know, there's acidity and creaminess, a bit of fruitiness, I think, as well in there. I get a little bit of sort of digestive biscuits. I don't know, that's just me, but a kind of malty, biscuity note. Certainly closer to the rind. I was picking that up. Becky, it's 7:10 now.
We're over.
So I think
there's so much we could still go into.
I know. Well, maybe we'll do another one. Another one
because I want to do more.
Yeah. Well, you've again, please look. They want an encore. Tracy's popped back in. I'm just gonna I just want to get a few plugs in for me and Becky. Let me just. Oh my God, I'm so. See, this is what happens when you drink whiskey and try to operate Zoom. It doesn't work. So yeah, it's just to finish up really. Well, I had see look how professional we've been today, Tracy. I've got a final slide to show, which is not usually what
Fantastic.
I do. So yes, this is so yeah, that was the thing I wanted to say. I wanted to say a big thank you to IJ Mellis for sending us down the cheese. I tried to pay him and he wouldn't let me. Which, you know, hats off to Rory for sending us those beautiful cheeses.
Thank you to Rory.
But it's definitely worth checking out Mellis because he has these really interesting Spanish cheeses, but great for Scott. You know, there's some really good Scottish cheeses that I don't see down in Brighton, and you don't see in the south as much. And then the whiskey, well, Becky, you sorted the whiskey, but people can buy from Whiskey Exchange and.
Yeah, also all the whiskies are available from the Whiskey Exchange or Master of Malt or any retailer, really. Please don't buy from Amazon. Maybe go to your local off license if possible. If I can just plug Our Whisky, if you enjoyed this, it seems like everyone watching knows a bit about whiskey, but if you want to learn more and you want to improve your education in a way that's not intimidating and fun and a vibrant atmosphere, with Our Whisky, I'm launching very soon a new series of masterclasses and tastings, just with a fun group of people, just like a club really. So if that's something you might be interested in, then head over to ourwhisky.com. It's a holding page at the moment while I'm feverishly trying to build a website. There's another string to my bow, but do leave your email, then you'll get an update when everything goes live, so you can be the first to hear about what we do launch as part of our whiskey education series.
Brilliant. And if you want to learn more about cheese, look me up, Online Cheese School at the Academy website, and I can spend hours talking about cheese, and often do. So yeah, have a look. There's plenty of courses there. But we'll stop plugging ourselves now, Tracy, and you can finish up now.
No, that was absolutely fabulous, both of you. Amazing. Thank you so much. I've learnt heaps as well. I'm sorry, Patrick. I know quite a lot about cheese. I'm going to the whiskey course.
Well, no, I'm quite tempted by Whiskey Club. I have to say,
yes.
The first rule of Whiskey Club is, get the right glass. That's the first.
I think Patrick and I are both going to be coming along.
But do you know what? This was a bit of an experiment, actually, cheese and whiskey for me, because I'm not a massive whiskey drinker. I'm not sure whether, and I have to say, genuinely, those matches, considering we sort of thought them up on paper in a way, didn't we, before actually tasting them, they were really good.
What did you put the humour with in the end? Because was it with the Benromach or yes,
Benromach, yeah.
It round, you had thought with the Port Charlotte, hadn't you?
Yes, it was there with the Port Charlotte. I had tasted them as one. I did say to Patrick, I think before the cheese arrived, I think maybe we may need to change them around a bit, but I wanted to taste them first. And actually, yes, to switch it around was the right decision in the end.
And I think from the comments that have been coming through, and thank you to everybody, all the participants for attending tonight, but thank you for all the chat. It's been really interesting as well. But I think from them, I think that was the favourite pairing. Looking at that, I think.
Well, the smoked, the humo, yeah, with the Benromach. I think that was my favourite. Although I'm just trying the Benromach now with the the blue.
No,
so-
he's still going. He's still
Yeah.
going.
The good thing about all these whiskies is they're all affordable. They're all less than £50 per
Can
bottle.
you buy them all as miniatures or not? No.
I think Master of Malt do a drinks by the dram service, which is where they decant the whiskies into small miniatures. You can buy them that way. They should be available. But I
The
think
dram isn't very much, is it?
it's not. But if you haven't tasted whiskey, if you're not that familiar with whiskey, it can be a big expense to buy a full bottle. It's interesting. I was actually doing a webinar last night all about the future of whiskey tastings at home, and how much people want to be buying miniatures of whiskies.
Yes.
Hopefully there'll be more minis produced in the future. So if
It's
you're
a
not
good way to do the selection, wouldn't it? And then find your favourite and buy a big one.
yes,
'Cause
absolutely.
we all
Well,
have a bar.
I think if anyone watching wants any suggestions or recommendations, or they're not sure about a purchase, then find me on Instagram or Facebook at Becky Paskin or at Our Whisky, and I'll be happy to help with anything.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, where someone has said, "Humo, boom, boom, shake the room, shake the room," we should do a little funk to that. Thank you so much to both of you. Amazing. Becky, please do come back, and Patrick, please do come back together, and let's do this again and do 3 more whiskies and 3 more cheeses.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, and sleep well, you two. Our whiskey inside. Oh. Bye, everyone.